Now, we've talked about some of this before, and we've talked about how incestuously intertwined the banking system is. But this is the first report that I know of where they took a much broader view. And frankly, this is what they said anyway in the abstract. Despite the growing research on network analysis, so that's that interconnected piece, there is still a limited understanding of how interconnectedness through the topographical configuration of a network may influence the resilience to and the contagion from adverse shocks. In other words, they really haven't taken a broad enough look to see how interconnected that we are and what the implications for the global economic system is. The world has become more interconnected over the past few decades. Thank you, globalization. Against this backdrop, economic and financial contagion following adverse shocks can have a severe impact on the global economy. Our model shows that economic and financial contagion are highly nonlinear, and many bystander economies can experience significant negative effects as the initial default is spread through the network. So that's all of that. They talk about it all the time, the cross-border payment systems, but it's much, much bigger than that. And we've been experiencing that on the supply side shock since we've gone to just in time. But since since the 80s, when they started really talking about globalization, and here in the U.S., they shipped all of that manufacturing mostly to China, but to many other places. Now we're feeling the impact of it, and they're taking a look at it because it certainly wouldn't have made any sense to take a look at it when it didn't suit their purposes. But this suggests that many economies might be systemically more important than what conventional measures of size or openness might suggest. And what they're really saying is that when we come up to this next shock, it could come from anywhere. So Black Swan event is something that happens that nobody can anticipate. So, any size country, not just Deutsche Bank, but any size country can cause this Black Swan global event, and they can't even see it. So I'm going to tell you, something wicked this way comes, and it's going to be very, very nasty, nasty, nasty indeed. The results have shown that contagion, once an initial default takes place, is highly correlated with the extent of interconnectedness of the economy. The model allows to identify the systemic importance of individual economies, which might be much larger than what conventional measures, which we've talked about, or size might suggest. I want to emphasize this because the response from most people is, well, that's over there. It can't happen here. So that's why a lot of times they tested, like the bail-in laws, they tested that in Cyprus. And that was most people's response until, of course, they wanted to take all of it and not think about the insured part of the deposits. People still didn't have access to it for about 5 years, but hey, what the hey. Generally speaking, though, if we look at the debt to GDP ratio, what we do know, and is pretty obvious to see, is once the pandemic hit, it's been growing anyway, right? But once the pandemic hit, then all bets were off. And we had both, this is important, so I'm going to repeat it, but we had governments and central banks working together in a synchronized fashion and growing that debt like crazy, as we can see. Now, these are emerging markets that are in debt distress. And you can see that that has actually been climbing pretty substantially since 2013. So the point here is that in 2008, The system died. It died. And all that happened was a lot of money printing and a lot more debt so that things appeared to the public like everything had been taken care of. But it hadn't. So it's just kind of like this, it's like this compressor, right? And the energy builds up and builds up and builds up, and it's going to spill over because, frankly, they are completely out of tools. So global debt has exploded, as has countries that are in debt distress. This graph from the IMF, you've seen a number of times. It's got Deutsche Bank here in the center because at the time that they did this, Deutsche Bank was the most systemically risky bank. But it goes all over the globe. These aren't just U.S. banks. These are all over the globe. And these little gray lines in between is really how they're interconnected to even smaller banks and local regional banks. Because remember, at least in this country, the Federal Reserve banks, the commercial banks, Bank of America, Chase, Wells Fargo, those guys, they are the support for the small community banks. That's where the small community banks actually get their money from. But these big banks do a lot of risky behavior, as we've talked about ever so many times. And I've shown you even recently about the derivatives. And that's really what the big risk is. So we know that banks are globally interconnected, but so are clearinghouses, which is where the central bank wants all of these big derivative transactions to pass through just a few clearinghouses. And by the way, DTCC, who is the legal registered owner of almost every stock and every bond, so all of these financial products, they're the biggest clearinghouse, and they are also the legal registered owner, and they are systemically important. So we have to ask if it's not just the financial system, which we know, and we've known how dangerous that interconnectedness is. Well, you know, the truth is almost everything is completely incestuously interconnected. And the interesting part is that this is the first time that anybody's taken a look at this. I think that's really fascinating. But what we see here, exports, imports, portfolio investment, direct investment, interbank transactions, so that's that cross-border stuff, and net asset positions. And we've seen this happen when MSCI came out with a new ETF based on China. So that was about letting a lot of funds flow to China, and now that thing is unraveling. Shocker. I mean, honestly, if you just pay attention a little bit, you know, this is what I always find. When I look at things just a little differently, it's amazing what you actually see. But this is what we're talking about today is a big, huge deal. A big, huge deal. So they say, including other channels of contagion and amplification effects are likely to increase the number of subsequently affected economies. The aggregate reserve losses, so the funny money, fiat money reserves, losses, and the vulnerability of the global economy. This should not come as a surprise to any of you who have been even paying attention a little teeny bit, because we still know that going to the grocery store, you're still finding empty shelves, or you'll find where they put up a couple of pieces in the front, and then when you take those, there's nothing in the back. I hope you have your food secure. I hope you have your food, water, energy, security, barterability, wealth preservation, community, and shelter secure, because this is the time to do that. I've shown you this graph a number of times, but this is updated to through 2021. They did it they did this in December. Bank of Canada Sovereign Debt Default Database 2022. Last observation, 2021. So this is sovereign, which is government, that have defaulted on their debts. And this goes all the way back to the start of this fiat money system. And these red bars are advanced economies. So the blue is like emerging markets and frontier economies. So you would expect more of that from there, right? And what happens, like take a look at Venezuela or Zimbabwe. And I bring those two up and I'm coming back to them in a minute. But basically, here you go. This is in Europe, this is the sovereign debt crisis. That's a lot of defaults. And even going into 2018. So the system wasn't fixed in 2008 or since 2008 because you have growing sovereign of advanced economy defaults. And now through 2021, they've actually even increased. In all, official creditor loans, which are sovereigns, governments, in default increased by 14.4 billion. So it's the highest level since 2018, which was the highest level since 2013 and 14, as you can see. It's growing, and that's the point. Because what we're taught is that government debt is the single safest thing that you can do, simply because they can print the money that they need to pay you back. Now, the value of that money in terms of purchasing power goes down, 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 down. That was the design. But on top of that, and that is the way advanced economies default, is through hyperinflation. Is America not going to pay their bonds? No. As long as they can print the money to pay them, why in the world would they make a choice to default? So when you see these red bars and those represent, advanced economy government debt, which is exactly what they represent, you have to understand that this is really a very big deal. And a lot of that money that gets defaulted on is owned outside of the country that can indeed create the money to pay the bills, unless, of course, these sovereigns, and we know that they've done this, have taken on dollar-denominated debt. We're in a really precarious position. Since 1960, 151 governments, so that's 2/3 of the existing 215 sovereigns, have defaulted on their obligations. How do you feel about that? Is that a shocking number for you? It should be, because it's definitely not what anybody's taught, because otherwise, why would you consider sovereign debt as the safest single thing that you can do? But you do have to understand that in advanced economies like the US, we will hyperinflate our debt away. Part of the strategy that I've developed that we execute here is based upon those repeatable patterns. And it's based upon, having good money gold to counter the hyperinflation and hold your purchasing power so that you can have the wealth transfer your way and you don't have to go through abject poverty. You got to keep this in mind. So a lot of people always ask me all the time, they've been asking me forever, when? And while I cannot tell you that it's going to be Tuesday morning at 8:35, it certainly could be. I mean, that's beyond my control or even my knowledge base to know the exact moment when we get this black swan event that ripples through the entire global economy. And hey, we got a little snicker snack taste of what that was back in 2020, didn't we? That was such a gift for those of us that are paying attention, because I'm thinking it spurred people on to get prepared. I know it did me. That's when I got my bug out house, right? I've been preparing since 2008, but that really showed me how close we are. And I think a lot of that was a test. And now I'm breathing a big sigh because I really don't want to talk to you about what I'm about to talk to you about, but I have to because they're talking about it. And if they're talking about it, central bankers are they're out of ammunition, they're out of tools, they're at the bottom. We have, interest rates have been anchored at zero or near zero since 2009. We went into negative territory the first time, but 2008, they've been anchored at zeros. Globally, central banks are raising interest rates right now to combat the inflation that they created. I mean, they're trying to combat it, but they're combating it at the same time when the global economy is slowing down. And that's going to push us into a hyperinflationary depression. That's what they're actually talking about, is what tools they would have during that period of time. So let's just go, right? Effective fiscal monetary interactions in severe recessions. So they're setting up a severe recession is a depression, people. They just don't want to use the term depression. Yeah, well, as we know, they can change definitions of many things. Here's the abstract, though. The separation, and this is the piece, the separation between fiscal and monetary policies is in question. In other words, the Fed's presumed independence from government may soon come to an end. Now, this is the kind of behavior that we see in Zimbabwe, and I think I have some of the currency that doesn't exist anymore, in countries that are hyperinflating away. This is really the kind of thing, that we see. Venezuela, that's 1 million bolivars, 500 million bolivars. Wow, that's a big number. But you know what you can buy with this 500 million bolivars? Absolutely nothing. Do not be blinded by numbers. They don't mean anything. And there are, there's over 4,800 of them. Those currencies buy absolutely nothing. That's the way typically when a government and a central bank now collude, that's what ends up happening. Government wants to spend money. And look at what's happening now. Fed is raising rates to fight the inflation that they caused at the same time that our government is being fiscally irresponsible and stimulating the economy through the anti-inflation law, that was recently passed. Yeah, in 10 years, you'll save $1,800 on your electricity bill. Do you think so? Do you think they have the ability to tell you what the truth is going to be in 10 years? No, but it sounds good. So we're going to spend a whole bunch of money now because that's what we want to do. And in 10 years, you're going to benefit. Woohoo! In 10 years, the system's going to look very, very different than it does today. So what they're talking about here in this paper is a more integrated approach of looking at policies can lead to a better policy mix. So the central bank and the government working together at the same time, which we did see during this COVID period, and ultimately, so 10 years down the road, ultimately, better macroeconomic outcomes under certain circumstances. But I read this whole paper and I never was able to glean what those certain circumstances were. You have the links, you read it, and if you can figure that out, please let me know. I would really appreciate it. Such an approach entails risks necessitating a clear assessment of each country's circumstances as well as safeguards, here's the piece, to protect the credibility of the existing institutional framework so that you continue to trust the government that's already in place. I don't mean that, we'll face an election and all of that, but the institution, the government that's in place, and the central banks that's in place. That is critical because this is a flipping con game, and every con game requires confidence. I personally have no confidence in these guys because I read too much of their stuff. But what you really need to be absolutely crystal clear on, crystal clear, this is a key step toward hyperinflation, where you have the central bank supporting the spending will of the government. We've seen it in Zimbabwe, we've seen it in Venezuela, we've seen it in Argentina, we've seen it over and over and over and over again. And it always ends up in hyperinflation. I don't know one instance when it doesn't. But they're out of tools. So this is them creating a new tool. Very large asset purchases have been required typically to reduce yields significantly. So that's all that new money that the Federal Reserve and other central banks have created to buy the government debt. This is part of the way that they fund the government debt. You know, our Federal Reserve did not buy government debt that at least is public knowledge prior to December of 2002. That's what third world countries do, not what developing nation or developed advanced economies do. It's not what they do. Well, it is what they do now, but historically that's not what they do. But empirical studies suggest that asset purchases in the range of 15 to 20% of GDP are required to lower 10-year yields by 100 basis points in the US and in the Euro area. And that has been what has been happening to suppress those interest rates because, you know, there was so much debt. And all of this, a lot of the debt, and not all of it, but a lot of the debt is short term. That means it rolls over. And what do? To stimulate an economy, typically, or at least since the 80s, the government has dropped interest rates anywhere between 5.5% and 5.75%. And then that inspires corporations and individuals to go out and borrow money because it seems cheap. Money's really cheap if they drop the interest rates 5.5%, 5.75%. But we've been anchored at zero or near zero since 2008. And every single time, every single country that has attempted to raise the rates, including the US, that made that attempt started in 2016, it has failed. It has failed. And now, that was like a little bit, a quarter of a point, a little bit. Now, because inflation is running so hot and they missed that opportunity, well, I don't even know that, here's the truth. If they had started raising rates earlier, do you really think it would have had an impact? Particularly when they sit there and they admit that they don't understand inflation and that what they're doing is not going to have any impact on the inflation that's caused by the supply chain issues and by the war. I mean, and by the flipping markets. Because everything has been turned into a financial product. It's all about the traders. Well, they are TRAITORS that are destroying the very system that they built, they created, and they fostered. And now they're trying to figure out how to save themselves. We've got to keep our credibility at all cost. Well, I don't think I mean, really, here's my wish. I don't think they can. I think that the curtains are being pulled back and the wool is being pulled off of people's eyes. The sooner you see this and take action, have a plan, and put in place those things that you need to have a reasonable standard of living, food, water, energy, security, barterability, wealth preservation, community, and shelter, the better off and the happier you're going to be. Because this is